You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome Jay Cost as an article out in the Weekly Standard, Barack Obama Corporate Shill, but he also has a book, and I hope I get this title correctly, but A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. Jay Cost, first of all, welcome to the Final Say Radio Show with Brett and John Rappaport.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, one of our favorite topics, picking on Barack Obama, and I guess, deservedly so, because he gives us so much to critique. But I think you're so right in what you're covering here. And I always say there's a lot of, hypocrisy and cronyism in Washington, but there's none greater than a president who makes arguments but does the same thing as he's making the argument. And you've pointed out so many different scenarios going back quite a few years, so of course I'll let you cover them. But I do appreciate what you've done here.
Well, thank you. Look, what motivated me was the other day was Obama got up on his high horse, which is one of his favorite perches, of course. He loves to be on his high horse. A very high horse. Yeah, he's very comfortable up there. He doesn't get dizzy, although maybe he should. He's up on his high horse trying to explain, he likes to explain his opponents, as in another favorite pose of his. He floats above all of us and explains us to ourselves, which is very charitable of him. But anyway, he's doing an interview with Vice, and Vice asked him, well, hey, why are, all these people resisting cap and trade, And he said, well, some folks, because that's one of his favorite phrases, some folks want to keep their gas prices low, but, there's a lot of, shilling in Congress. A lot of people are on the take from the oil companies. I thought, well, I just wrote a book about American political corruption that covers the whole history of political corruption from the founding to the present day and tries to explain it. And indeed, this is true. Congress is full of shills, and it's a major problem that Congress has, and there's no doubt about it. But Obama himself is a shill. He was a shill when he was in Congress. He rewrote or influenced the rewriting of tariff laws to favor local industries in Illinois, one of which turned around and gave him about $1,000 in a campaign contribution. And he worked closely with lobbyists for exactly that purpose, So, give me a break. The guy's a shill, too. And then as president, he's done some extraordinarily cynical things. When he was running in 2008, he complained, and he complained correctly, that the pharmaceutical lobbying group, had too great a say in the writing of the Medicare prescription drug bill. And after Billy Townsend, who was chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, quit Congress, he went and became the chief lobbyist for pharma after having basically written the prescription drug bill. Obama pointed out correctly that this is outrageous. It is outrageous. But when he became president and he wanted to pass Obamacare, he turned around and cut a deal with Billy Townsend and pharma. And it's a big reason why, we used to hear Democrats complain all the time about how expensive prescription drugs are, and wouldn't it be great if we could re-import them from Canada? They don't talk about that anymore. And they don't talk about it anymore because Obama cut a deal with the pharmaceutical industry. In exchange for supporting Obamacare, the Democrats would take that, they would yank that provision out of the bill, and they would basically shut up about the reimportation of drugs, which is why, by the way, next year when the presidential campaign begins in earnest, Hillary Clinton will not say a word about reimportation of drugs, even though a decade ago that was all they could talk about.
It's interesting. I have a quick comment, and then I'll throw out two joint questions, I guess. One is, when Barack Obama was an attorney in Chicago and he was representing the apartment buildings, he threw a lot of people out on the street, the same people that he's been claiming the whole time that he represents. So that's another example. But you mentioned cap and trade, and Chris Smith happens to be the congressman, and I'm in his district, and I've known him for a long time. And I was upset that he initially had supported cap and trade, and I questioned him on it personally. And he had shared with me, I was lied to. They misrepresented a lot of the stuff that was presented to me, and I accepted some of that on face value. And of course he changed his position. And so you get a lot of that in Congress. You think something's okay, you go along with it, and then you realize it's bad, and you change your mind. You're allowed to change your mind. But here's the issue of what you've brought up. you're bringing up, actual examples of hypocrisy and significant, issues of talking out of one side of your mouth but doing something on the other. And with Barack Obama, you may cover this, but we have a large part of our media who will not discuss the facts that you're presenting. And that's a shame, because I think regardless of party or who does this, it needs to be discussed. So I'm thanking you for the work that you do.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And look, I think one of the things to keep in mind about the mainstream media is that, look, what do they thrive on? What is the lifeblood of being a journalist inside the Beltway? It's access. Is ultimately is what it is. It's access. And access is a commodity, just like anything else. It can be bought and sold. And, they're not going to write critical investigatory pieces about the president because they will be shut out from the president in the future. The president will just deny them access. And so, I think that's something really important to keep in mind, is that, the media is on the hook in so many respects as well. They're part of, they're not on the outside. They're part of the institutions that operate within politics and government. And if you come to the conclusion, as I do in my book, that these institutions themselves, not just the people who occupy them temporarily, but the institutions themselves are broken, then you can't expect pressure from the inside. It has to come from the outside. It has to come from people who are not caught up in the institutions themselves. And so the media will do occasional due diligence in some ways, like uncovering Aaron Schock's sort of abuse of his campaign funds, for instance. They'll do things like that. But no, look, they're not going to do some sort of systematic expose on how American policy, public policy, is sold to the highest bidder, which happens on issue after issue after issue. In my book, I look at farm subsidies, Medicare, the pork barrel, corporate taxes, and financial services regulation, and I found the same thing again and again. Public policy is parceled out to the highest bidder, in effect. And both parties are guilty.
Jay, I have two different questions that I wanted to cover with you. This is John. The first thing is following up on what you just said. Isn't this one of the big issues that we really had in this net neutrality bill, which on the surface sounds like a very nice, sweet, wonderful thing, the downside of which is that you now are giving government regulatory control of the Internet, and based on what you just said, which I would just sum up as saying, corporate media is not for the best interest of the American populace. It's for the best interest of their news/entertainment, and which of course is entirely based upon access. So I wanted to get your opinion on that from a perspective of both net neutrality and the whole need for tier 2 journalists, people like Brett and I, for example, to keep the government in check because the mainstream media is not doing their job.
Yeah, well, first of all, to your second point, absolutely. That's what you have to do. You just got to keep up the pressure, and you have to find every opportunity to ring the alarm bell. But look, on the issue of net neutrality, I have no faith in the government to regulate the Internet in an impartial, fair, Republican, small R Republican manner. I don't expect them to be neutral at all, and I think that's a classic. The use of the phrase neutrality is a classic Orwellian, scam. It's similar. It reminds me of the Marketplace Fairness Act, which was something that they tried to ram through the Congress last year. It passed through the Senate, but it got jammed up in the House of Representatives. But, the Marketplace Fairness Act was anything but fair. It was basically a payout to brick-and-mortar companies at the expense of small internet-based businesses, and that's what they do. They give these pieces. And look at the Affordable Care Act. It's called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Patients are neither protected nor offered affordable care under that legislation. And they do that on purpose. They do it. They want you to have to dig. They don't want you to be able to see the problems at first glance. They want you to have to take a second or a third or a fourth glance because they're betting, and unfortunately it's a good bet, that you're going to get distracted along the way and you're not going to follow through. And that's what, and it's a game that's been played, and like I said, in my book, it's a history of political corruption from the beginning of the country's founding. I don't look at things as a matter of good guys versus bad guys. I look at it from the perspective of, well, what are the rules of the game? And the rules of our game are broken, and they have been broken, in my opinion, for generations.
It's interesting the way you frame that, because just recently, I think it was even yesterday or so, but Glenn Beck has basically just come out and said, you know what, I can't even support the Republican Party anymore, because what's the difference between really, really bad guys who hate the Constitution and semi-bad guys who dislike the Constitution? In the end, we have to break both of their backs. And the guys and the Republicans are doing a lousy job of being good stewards as well. If you think about what really built this country, American exceptionalism is really the story of a system that basically rewarded innovation and execution and punished failure. Okay, when the pioneers went across the country, if you failed, you froze to death with your wife, with your mother, with your kids. That's what made greatness persevere. It wasn't, don't worry, if you fall, the government will pick you up and wipe your knee. And I think this, the way I read into what you're stating in your book, is that we have a problem now where we've taken the power of the American voter and handed it basically to K Street lobbyists who, essentially are running this new system of government, which basically is rewarding institutionalized corruption. And that results in regulation, which really runs the country, and, by the way, also offsets the entire constitutional balance of power, which helps greatly embolden whoever's sitting in the executive office. And the ultimate loser is the American people and the American system that helped build this great nation. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would comment on, I think Glenn Beck is wrong to leave the Republican Party. I think that's a bad strategic move for a couple reasons. Number one, the two parties are operating a cartel on our election process. They coordinate with each other to restrict access to third parties, and they will throw up any manner of roadblock to stop a third party from becoming a viable political force. This is just what they do. And they have been doing this since the 19th century. The first major third party was the Populist Party, at least in the post-Civil War era, and they were totally co-opted by the Democrats, and it destroyed them. That's what they do. Political parties, you have to think of political parties in competition with each other in some respects, but they are also a cartel, which means they have an alliance against third parties. So there is really there's no getting around the two major parties. That being said, the two parties are still basically at their fundamental roots are an open system. The parties are open. They are not closed off. We're not talking about Tammany Hall here, which was a closed system, and the only way you could get in would be to be invited. The Republican Party could be reformed in 18 months. The next election is in 18 months. I guess it's in 20 months. You could reform the entire Republican Party root and branch in 20 months or less with the primaries. This is an enormous tool that it just boggles my mind that people are prepared to quit the Republican Party rather than start taking advantage of primaries and electing candidates who are going to bring about institutional change within Congress. So I think that's a very short-sighted, and it's the easy way out. I think it sort of makes for a good talking point. But practically speaking, if you want to reform government, there is no other alternative than one of the two parties, both of which are open, and it could be the parties themselves need reformed, and it could be done. And I think, moreover, one of the things that people who are tired of the Republican Party, and I myself am tired of the Republican Party, I think it's easy to overlook, is that the problem is not the Republican Party. The problem is Congress, okay? The Republican Party took control of Congress about 20 years ago. In 1994. But Congress also took control of the Republican Party, which is to say Congress operates on a set of broken badly designed, essentially corrupt rules. Congress itself is premised upon a massive conflict of interest, which is members of Congress give public policy to the highest bidders who support their campaigns, lobby them aggressively, and take care to make sure that their post-political careers are secured. It's a conflict of interest. And the Republican Party, when they got control of Congress, and Republicans in Congress did not reform, did not get rid of that conflict of interest, and now it has overwhelmed them within Congress. So the problem is not the Republican Party per se, in my estimation. It is Congress. And I would suggest that if we were to go through all of the insane legwork of forming a third political party and actually acquire power in Congress, if we don't reform the rules of Congress themselves, that third party will become similarly corrupted. So it's really a matter of sort of, I would say that the problem within the Republican Party, first of all, there are solutions. You don't have to walk away. And second of all, those problems are actually a symptom of the larger malady, which is a Congress that is now dysfunctional at its very core.
Before I yield the mic to Brett, I think you're actually spot on, and I would point out that one of the great opportunities that is embodied by, let's say, the Tea Party movement is actually that by changing from within, you can caucus with the Republican Party, but win in do what they did through Eric Cantor, for example, right? But you could win in the primaries, you can caucus with the Republican Party, but once you build up critical mass, then you have an opportunity to impact Congress. Without it, you're never going to change Congress, and the game will continue ad nauseum.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I would add to that, look, a lot of the things that we find so offensive about Congress has been doing for generations now. You know, we complain about the Export-Import Bank. That was a creation of the Franklin Roosevelt administration. We complain about farm subsidies, or lately they're complaining about the doc fix in Medicare. All of this stuff is very old. One of the primary reasons why we're noticing it now, even though it's very old, it's bothering us now because now conservative reformers actually have, a foot in the door. And we can see inside, and we can see just how messed up everything is. I would say, 15 years ago, there were a handful of genuine reformers in Congress 15 years ago, but they weren't the force that they are now. Now there is enough of a force that they're actually giving the establishment some headaches, which is making things interesting, and I think it's leading to frustration among reformers, like why can't they do more? But it's actually a good sign. I think it's a sign we got our foot in the door.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to bring up Congressman, the old Congressman Zell Miller, who criticized his own party and wrote a book actually called "A National Party No More," and he saw this coming. And to your point of leaving the Republican Party, I would say this. I think you're spot on, because how many Democrats who were maybe moderate or conservative Democrats or maybe not as left as the party has shifted to now have either become Republicans, have been voted out of office, or have been forced out of their positions by their own party. And I think for a party to have its own checks and balances is part of what makes a two-party system work. Otherwise, we may as well have no parties. And to your point, we've already seen several major presidential campaigns decided because of the action of a third party, which is really nothing but a control of another entity, really.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, when we talk about checks and balances, what we're talking about there are the rules of the game, all right? And I agree. I think that, we have conservatives spend a lot of time thinking about public policy. In the 90s we were thinking about welfare reform, in the 80s we were thinking about tax policy, nowadays we're thinking about, health care policy. We think about policy. But policy is ultimately the product of process. And not just the process within the Congress itself, the committee system and the structure and all of that stuff, but also the process of selecting, members to get into Congress. And we have primaries and we have general elections. General elections you can't change. Those are basically, set in stone. But, the process of nominating candidates is, part and parcel of when we talk about the rules of the game and we talk about checks and balances. The process of nomination is part of that. And I think that, number one, I think it's an underutilized tool among conservatives. I think that grassroots conservatives who are upset about Congress are too quick to vote to renominate incumbent members without checking to see whether or not they deserve renomination, or more likely they don't even bother to vote at all. So I think that's one problem. But I think another problem is that, the primaries are just a very bad system of control anyway. I wrote a couple years ago, I wrote an article for National Affairs making the case that we need to really think about root and branch reform of the presidential nominating system, because primaries don't work. They don't produce good candidates. They're very inefficient. They produce candidates who aren't reflective of the broader party electorate. And I think you can make the same point about congressional primaries as well, that congressional primaries, you get something like 15% turnout in a primary. I mean, what good is that? How is that any kind of actual check on members of Congress? And it's really, the nomination is the most powerful point of leverage that conservatives have over Republicans. And one of the problems that conservatives have is that the nomination is doled out in a very slipshod, ad hoc, haphazard manner. We don't use it as a tool to constrain members of Congress, to force them to behave properly when they get to Washington, D.C. 9 times out of 10, the person who raises the most money wins the primary nomination in an open seat, and then after that he wins the nomination regardless of what happens next. That's why the Cantor defeat was so noteworthy, is because it's so rare. And I think that's one of our problems, is that there were 240 some odd members of Congress who were up for renomination in 2014. I think 2 of them lost. You're telling me that of the 240, 238 were sound? I don't think so. I would say there's probably about 100 sound guys, 100 that I take or leave, and another 50 that I think we should get rid of.
I think you're being kind with your numbers, but I agree with you. We've interviewed probably in excess of about 125 members of Congress over the years, and we've interviewed them because we like them or we enjoy some of the things that they do. It is shocking, though. I mean, the system definitely needs to be looked at. We need to make modifications, and it is really pathetic, if for lack of another word, that so few people in a primary decide the future of a state, or of the state of Congress, or of the presidency. Jay, we have about 30 seconds left, so I just want to give you one last opportunity to give your book a plug, and I'll allow you to give the title.
Well, thank you. The book is called A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. It's available now at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore. And, the point of the book, the reason I wrote it was not just to sort of catalog all the lurid details of American political corruption, but also to try and explain the how and especially the why. And the book itself doesn't point toward particular reforms. I don't propose any reforms, but I think if people are upset about this sort of sustained dysfunction in our government, I would recommend the book, because that's why I wrote it, because I was upset and I was trying to understand exactly what the problem is, and the book is my effort to try and understand it.
Excellent. Jay, do you have any social media that you'd like to share with our listeners as well?
Yeah, you can always follow me on Twitter. I'm at my Twitter handle is jcosttws, all one word. And, of course, you can check me out at weeklystandard.com.
Excellent. It's a pleasure speaking with you. We've enjoyed the discussion, and, of course, we'll look forward to having you back sometime in the future. Jay Koss, you have a wonderful afternoon. No problem.
Thanks.
All right, take care.